The formation of the Inch housing scheme. The Inch is located in the south of Edinburgh, adjacent to the old villages and hamlets of Liberton. The housing and community development was planned in the 1940s. Tenants moved in during the early 1950s. The Evening News heralded the Inch as Edinburgh's Garden City. This talk will describe the events that led to its creation and hopefully explains a little as to why the Inch was so special. Edinburgh Corporation and its architect David Stratton Davis created something really quite exceptional. The design by Stratton Davis, having won the All-British contest, was widely acclaimed. In the summer of 1952, the Royal Institute of British Architects held their annual conference in Edinburgh. Members heard papers on Scottish housing, past and present, and architects' contribution to housing. A highlight of the conference was a tour of the Inch housing scheme. The 1996 Historic Scotland publication, Scotland, Building for the Future, stated that the Inch illustrated the corporation's adherence to the utopian principles of Scotland's wartime Secretary of State, Tom Johnson MP. In 1954, the Saltire Society declared the Inch as the best local authority housing in Scotland. Hopefully my talk will explain why it achieved this accolade. In telling the story, I will put the development of the Inch into its historical context. I will describe some of the pre-war housing conditions and why moving to the Inch had such an impact on that first generation of tenants. For many, it was transformational. The vision that gave rise to the Inch emerged from the post-war consensus. That consensus was shared right across the social and political classes in Britain. That consensus demanded that things should change for working people. The momentum for change had been building up since the Great War, Lloyd George's famous speech about building a land fit for heroes. Despite significant progress in the 1920s and 30s, very many working class people still lived in extremely poor conditions at the outbreak of World War II. The commitment to building a new future for our people was reinforced during the struggle. Churchill had declared the policy of waging war until victory would be incomplete and indeed spoiled if it was not accompanied by a policy of food, work and homes in the period following victory for the men and women who fought. Housing construction stalled in the early years of the war, but while the war was being waged, the entire country was soon mobilised to build new homes. In 1942, Tom Johnson, the then Secretary of State for Scotland, set up the Scottish Advisory Committee on Housing. Its remit was to report on the design, construction, internal layout, planning and furnishing of new homes. Joseph Westwood MP, a former miner, chaired the committee. The committee published its report in 1944, copies sold for 3 shillings. The committee went to great lengths to survey what types of housing men and women serving in the armed forces wanted. Overwhelmingly, 83% wanted single or 2-storey houses, detached or terraced or flatted dwellings. Most also wanted to rent rather than buy their homes. The committee reported on all aspects of housing, including gardens, open spaces, community services, pathways, trees, everything. It was a remarkable piece of work. It could be a template for housing policy today. In October 1944, Edinburgh councillors were advised that Scotland's Department of Health now considered it essential for local authorities to build a substantial number of large houses. Authorities were urged to proceed at once with the preparation of land and plans. In late October, Edinburgh's Housing Committee acknowledged that something like 40,000 houses would be needed, and that would require significant purchases of land. Sites were identified across the city, including 2 potential sites to the south of the Inch House, Nether Liberton. Planning continued through 1945. The Scotsman of February 1946 announced that houses were to be built at Nether Liberton. In that very first article, the idea to use the Mansion House as a community centre was reported. Edinburgh Corporation later purchased the Inch estate from the aristocratic Gilmour family for the sum of £66,000. At the time, Lady Mary Gilmour visited estate workers to reassure those worried about their future. She asked them not to be upset, explaining, the soldiers must have houses. The scale of mobilisation in the city was unprecedented. Not only was Edinburgh planning to build permanent houses right across the town, but it was also building thousands of prefabricated homes. This housing drive presented a real challenge to the city. In those days, the city architect was responsible for all corporation building and construction works. To accelerate the pace of development, the city architect Ebenezer J. McCrae proposed that private architects be appointed to design the layout of the housing development at Nether Liberton. The council decided to launch an all-Britain competition to select the architect. In May 1946, it was announced the Lord Provost, magistrates and council of the City and Royal Borough of Edinburgh invite architects of British nationality resident in Great Britain to submit an open competition designs for the development of the housing estate at the Inch, Nether Liberton, Edinburgh. £500 would be paid for the winning design. The conditions and general instructions for the competition were comprehensive. The design competition was for housing and community development. The Gilmore estate was partitioned into three areas referred to as A, B and C. Area A corresponded to the Waterscott Avenue side of the Inch, Area B the Glenvarloch side, and Area C to the Inch Park. The size of each was 72 acres, 50 acres and 70 acres respectively. A and B were to be used for housing, whilst Area C was largely to be used for recreational facilities for the residents of the new community. The natural features of the area were to be retained, as were all buildings in Area C, including the mansion house and its historic walled garden. The community was to be self-sufficient and was to include shopping centres, schools, nurseries, churches, community centre and recreational facilities. Houses would comprise cottages and flatted houses of no more than 2 stories and a proportion of 3-storey tenements. Houses would have 4 or 5 apartments. Every house would have access to gardens and drying areas. Not foreseeing the current level of car ownership, only 1 in 20 houses needed to have provision for a lock-up garage. 68 designs were submitted in the competition. The successful design was submitted by the architect David Stratton Davis of Gloucester. Stratton Davis's model of Inch community development, including its parkland, is shown here. It was exhibited at the 1951 Festival of Britain. Stratton Davis was born on 17th August 1917. He was only 29 years old when he won the competition. He had studied at the Royal West of England Academy. During the war, Stratton Davis had served in the Royal Engineers. He served in France, Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands. He worked on the design of the Inch during his demobilisation. After the war, he joined the family firm based in Edinburgh and Gloucester. Perhaps not surprisingly, his house designs were influenced by the architectural features and styles of England's West Country cottages. In 1956, he was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. The design of the Inch featured in his fellowship papers. Very many of the Inch's first tenants came from the slums of central Edinburgh. They came from the likes of the High Street, Canongate, Greenside and the Pleasance. It can't be overstated the impact it had on their lives. For many, it was transformational. They often moved from dark, dingy slums in the centre of Edinburgh to a garden city in the countryside. There's a telling clause in that 1944 report. One of the recommendations was that a house's living room in future ceases to be reckoned as a sleeping apartment. Many of those first tenants lived in what can only be described as festering slums. Poor sanitation, outside communal toilets, no bathrooms, no hot water, overcrowding. It was a very challenging environment to raise a family in. And if I can make one personal observation, I can't even begin to imagine what it was like for my grandmother bringing up 13 children in such conditions. The Inch was designed as a self-contained community. It had its own shops, its own public house, schools and recreational facilities. The provision of ample shops in the Inch was in stark contrast to pre-war schemes such as Craigentinny. As well as its own parkland, it had open green spaces throughout the scheme. Every street had a square that young children could play in within sight of their parents. It was located in the environs of Liberton and Craigmillar, alongside its old villages and hamlets, and was surrounded by countryside and farmland on all sides. The attention paid to the design of the scheme was remarkable. Stratton Davis, the architect, quite specifically laid out the scheme so residents could enjoy the views towards the Braids, Arthurseat and the woods of Craigmillar. He organised the streets and houses around the Gilmore Estate's mature trees, as shown here. This particular photograph was taken shortly after tenants first moved in. As well as taking advantage of the natural features that already existed, he obtained permission to plant a further 500 trees some 2 years before the first tenants moved in. Such was his foresight. The quality of housing in the Inch was beyond the dreams of very many families. They had perhaps moved from a room and kitchen in the Edinburgh slum to a large house in the countryside. There was a mix of 2 and 3 bedroom dwellings, including terraced houses, flatted apartments and tenements. Small homes for pensioners were also located in the scheme. There were some 40 different house designs overall. The larger houses had their own dedicated living room, a dining room, a scullery, 3 bedrooms, an inside bathroom, a hallway and a coal cellar. Everyone had access to a garden, with the majority having their own front and back greens. Houses had all the latest features, including ample storage space and cupboards, all of which had been stipulated in that 1944 report on planning for new homes. One of the exceptional things about the Inch was the amount of land given over to community and recreational facilities. Most of Area C was to be used for community purposes. This represented almost a third of the Gilmore estate bought by Edinburgh Corporation, some 50 odd acres. This was in addition to the land the Corporation purchased immediately adjacent to the scheme at Kirkbrae for school playing fields. All the natural features of Area C were retained, including all shrubbery and trees. Provision was made for sports, including football and rugby pitches, a cricket green, putting, tennis courts and bowling greens. A 9-hole pitch and putt course was also established. All of this accorded with the 1944 report on the planning of our new homes. The primary school would be located on the hill and open to the park for the benefit of its pupils. The only element of the bold community plan that wasn't implemented was that the park's historic walled garden became the site of the council's plant nursery. The first tenants moved in late 1951. Tenants were reported to be very happy and proud of their new homes. They praised the design, layout, convenience and siting of the houses. The Inch received very many plaudits, as well as being awarded a prize by the Saltire Society as being the best designed local authority housing in Scotland. George McNiven, the principal architect of the Department of Health for Scotland, stated of the Inch, "It's outstanding as regards the layout and development of the site. The plans of the houses are extremely well arranged and exhibit a very high standard of design." William Darlin, MP, wrote, "The Corporation has many critics and it gives me, a moderately competent and experienced observer, the greatest pleasure to congratulate it on this successful practical achievement." The publication Edinburgh Today declared, "Planned with imagination and care, the new community at the Inch Liberton is one of the few modern suburbs in which we can take pleasure and pride." The publication concludes, "This development of the new community is a great improvement on anything that has been undertaken in the city before, and for the first time a new housing area has been laid out with care and imagination." The Inch featured in Stanley Gale's 1949 book, Modern Housing Estates. Indeed, the Inch featured on the book's frontispiece and dust cover. Gale observed that in Stratton Davis' designs for both the site and the houses, he had been particularly successful in retaining the semi-rural character of the area. All the delightful natural features of the site have been carefully retained. Bailey Campbell stated in 1953 that the Inch had been designed in the best post-war manner. The creation of the Inch was a direct result of the progressive vision of post-war town planners and politicians. With the Inch, the Corporation had created an exceptional living environment. Despite the challenges of post-war Britain, the labour and material shortages, the financial pressures, they resisted the temptation to simply pack the houses in. The corporation had succeeded not just in building houses, it built a community in its own parkland. As municipal engineer Stanley Gale declared in his 1949 book, it's obvious that a progressive policy of good housing, abundant open spaces, is highly advantageous in terms of human life and well-being. This was undoubtedly the outcome for that first generation. They received a massive boost to their life chances. Edinburgh Corporation and Stratton Davis had set out to establish Britain's finest garden city. They very much succeeded in that endeavour.